the Bible, what the Bible literally says. Now, I'm a Catholic. I'm protected from that. We didn't read the Bible. We never had that problem. But I understand the terror, because for me the terror was the terror of saying something that contradicted the teachings of the church, Holy Mother. And same terror, same fear of contradicting papal infallibility on the one hand, contradicting biblical inerrancy on the other hand. Biblical inerrancy, papal infallibility. Pick your poison. Pick your poison. One's as lethal as the other. One's as deeply is as deep a misunderstanding of what religion is as the other. I don't know which one is worse, but which fills you with more terror. So I think just theologically, apart from the sociology, which is where I actually think the problem is, just theologically or philosophically, I think there are two misunderstandings about religion which explain a lot of this. The first is what a philosopher or theologian from many years ago who's making a comeback in the last 10 years or so, a man named Paul Tillich, who Dick studied with in Chicago, called supernaturalism. Supernaturalism. That is, the belief that the scriptures are telling us about, the scriptures are reporting information to us that is otherwise unavailable. Revelation means information that reason alone can't get to, but has been revealed to us from above by supernatural forces, or supernatural powers, which inspired the writers, which report to us supernatural things that happen, which is the test of faith, whether we're willing to believe, whether we have said to and affirm extraordinary supernatural events like Jesus appearing after his death and eating, going out onto the sea to help the disciples fish, and then having fish with them after having breakfast afterwards. That story. That story, right? Story told by someone, story unknown to anybody else in the New Testament. Nobody else ever heard of that story except the author, whoever the author of that gospel was, who we got to call later on John. And it's a story. It's a narrative. Now, there's a certain amount of what you call demythologizing going on. You have to first of all recognize this was a story told by in what we call the imagination of the first century. Right? So you want to be able to demythologize it and get loose from that part of it. But then the other half of it is stories are meant to be read. They're meant to tell us something. A mythos is a story, it's a narrative. And what do you do with stories? You don't just demythologize them, you read them. Because they're telling you something. And the question is, what are they telling you? What are they telling you now? Not what did they mean in the first century. But what is it saying now? It's not a report about supernatural events. It's a poetic, literary, narratival expression of something that somehow or another connected back to their memory of Jesus, told by people who never laid eyes on Jesus. But it's part of their memory, part of that community's memory, because it's different from it's so different from the memories of the people that wrote down the other three Gospels that they call it the fourth Gospel. Meaning it's not, you can't match it up page for page with the other three. The other three fit, they clearly belong together. They're called synoptics. This one is really, really different. It's very mystical, it's very strange. It's got the story of Lazarus, totally unknown to anybody else in the New Testament. And it's got a thing about love, it's got a thing about the eternal logos, and it's very, very focused on resurrection in a way that more strongly than the other Gospels. So it's a narrative that's trying to tell us something. It's not reporting facts of the matter about a supernatural being somewhere who came down to earth, dwelt among us for a while, and then returned to his celestial home. Although that's the literal part of the story. The story is a story. Right? Supernaturalism, in supernaturalism, we're imagining some kind of power that is outside, rooted outside the spatio-temporal world, that breaks into that world and is that me?
It just broke in. I think I might have been an
inbreaking. That's why I was trying to keep my distance from that. In the sermon, when we were testing the sound before the sermon, we realized I couldn't say anything that began with a P or a B because the thing went boom. Anyway. The scriptures are not stories about a supernatural being who came down to the world of space and time to straighten things out and then return. The scriptures are the products of the imagination of people whose communities were bound the way this church is bound as a community, people who supported one another, in the name of what in Acts called the way. Because you saw that in the Acts passage we read this morning. They didn't have the word Christianity, they just called it the way. And the way was the memory and the promise of whoever this was. I like to call him Yeshua, to get rid of the baggage. Jesus sounds too much like central Pennsylvania to me. I say Yeshua is Hebrew, is Aramaic, to get rid of the baggage. It was a memory of Yeshua and a promise that organized these communities and kept them together and got them to start writing it down. They started writing it down because they realized he was supposed to come back any day now. It's now 30 years and counting. He's still not coming back. Maybe we better start writing it down. And what they write down is what, as a philosopher, I like to call the event that took place in the life and death of Jesus, that produces these memories, which produces the stories that we tell about him, which imaginatively, figuratively, poetically embody what we remember and what was being promised. And it all turned on this figure of the kingdom of God. What it would be like if God ruled, not the Romans. So there's an ironic use of this word, basileia, purity. So, not supernatural, but a kind of poetics, kind of religious or theo.
An intervention from above.
Supernatural. Second thing is the confusion of belief and faith.
We can't hear you.
Put it up.
Yeah, it's on.
It's on.
Right. The second thing is, how much of that did you not hear? Now you tell me you can't hear me. The second thing is, I think, the confusion of belief and faith. Beliefs are the kinds of things that are in your head because of the time and the place in which you were born. Right? What we call the gift of faith is by and large an accident of birth. Right? Well, I was once lecturing in the Middle East, and I was doing my shtick, and afterwards this a theologian from, we were in Oman, not Amman, Jordan, but the Sultanate of Oman, and this the Muslim theologian came up to me. He said, look, he says, the reason you're a Christian is you were born in Philadelphia, and the reason I'm a Muslim is that I was born in Nesquik. Muscat. And I said, that's actually sort of what my point was today, what I was trying to say. So, beliefs are what's in your head because of the time and place in which you were born. They're culturally relative beliefs. This man Tillich said, theology is the theology of culture. It's always what the memory and the promise of Jesus is in the culture in which you live, in the one in which you are situated. And they can change, and sometimes you can not only alter them, but drop them altogether, because sometimes they can just get in the way. The beliefs that you acquired as a Christian or whatever might prove to be an obstacle to the deeper inquiry that you're involved in. The faith, on the other hand, is you may lose your beliefs, but you never want to lose your faith, because your faith is a deep structure. It's this sort of deep self that is about which you're very confused, right? Because we don't know who this deep self is, or if there was only one. Jacques Derrida, my favorite philosopher, used to say. He was one time asked if he was, he wrote a little essay in which he described himself, in which he said of himself that he rightly passes for an atheist. And so, whenever I went to Villanova, I would say to him, and I knew what he was going to say, but it's a great question to ask for the audience. I said, well, why do you say you rightly pass for an atheist? Why don't you just say, je suis, say moi, I am an atheist. And he says, well, he says, because I don't know. He says, maybe I'm not an atheist. That is what they say. They may be right. I don't know. He says, I have many selves inside me, and they give me no rest. They give one another no rest. So the deep self is not one. It is a kind of topsy-turvy or turmoil of competing things, all of which go back to a certain kind of deep search. Where am I with time? When did I start? I started at 20 out, so I got to wrap up quickly. Right. Let me just jump to this thing. This man Tillich, that I referred to before, had a very interesting analysis of doubt. And he said, the way I like to summarize it is, you're not saved by faith, you're saved by doubt. Because he said, what doubt does, someone who doubts is someone who's looking. He's not skeptic. He didn't say skepticism, saved by skepticism. He said saved by doubt. So doubt presupposes faith. It presupposes you're searching. And the more searching the doubt, the more access we have to the deep searcher. The more questioning the question, the more access we have to this quester, this one who's looking. We use today a lot of popularity around the notion of journey, religious journey. Searching, questing. Faith has to do with the deep structure of something which we take to be of unconditional value, unconditional worth. Something that we're willing to put ourselves in harm's way for. Tillich called it a matter of unconditional concern. And it's not merely subjective. It's not just merely the searcher searching that constitutes the religious structure, the structure of a deep religion, or the deep structure of religion. It's not just the searcher searching. or the unconditional affirmation that I make of something, but it's because something has I have been visited by something. I'm like Paul. We're all like Saul becoming Paul. We're all like on the road to Damascus. And something has gotten to us. Something has reached us. Something that matters in a deep and uncompromisable way. That, I think, is the deep structure of what we call in Christian Latin religion. And I'm trying to problematize that word, religion, because it's one of our words. It's a Western word. It's a Christian word. It's tied up with the history of colonialism, too. But what we call religion has to do with this matter of uncompromisable importance. A matter of the utmost seriousness. What's that? Well, it's not defined by its region. You know, it's not what you do. It's not God if you don't call it God. It might be scientific research. It might be art. It might be the work of creative imagination in the arts. It might be running a hospice. It might be teachers or doctors without borders, people who give up a comfortable practice in the suburbs and put themselves in harm's way in order to stamp out the Ebola virus in West Africa, who don't have a, quote, religious bone in their body. Right? Why? Because there's something of the utmost seriousness at stake for them. And it's not their doing. I like to say God is not a projection. The name of God. What's going on in the name of God? Whatever is happening when we use that word. I'm not referring to a supernatural being somewhere. I'm saying God is one of the best words we have for naming something of unconditional importance. And that can happen almost anywhere. That's what's serious about religion, about the structure of religious existence, about what religion is. And so, and it may or may not be found in a church. More often than not nowadays, I think it's not found in a church. It's found in places like this. But I worry about what else is going on in the name of God. That, I think, is the matter of can we, as I started off asking, can you take religion seriously? I think religion is the matter of taking things seriously. Do we need the churches at all? It depends on what day you ask me. When they're working right, they're a kind of special place that we've reserved to remember this. That they serve a function. So you got religion inside the culture, which is different from politics and art and science, etc. And then you have this other kind of religion that I'm talking about now, which is a kind of deep structure. I'm not saying we should get rid of the religion in the culture, the cultural practice called religion. I'm saying I want it to be porous and open and exposed to this deeper search, this deeper self. And then we'll understand that what we're talking about are not inerrant books or infallible clergy, but matters of ultimate concern. And our religious practices are like reminders of something that we might otherwise forget. They serve a purpose as a kind of token or symbol of something deeper. So that story we heard about Jesus having fish after breakfast, after the sun came up, is a symbol of something. It's telling us something important. And the question is what? And that requires reading and study and reflection and conversation. But it does not require being literalized. If you literalize it, you've ruined it. So anyway, let me stop there because it's 12:15. So we got to get out of here by when?
22-1 at the latest.
22.
20-1 at the
Oh,
latest.
22. Okay, let me stop here.
By the way, when we do break up, if some people can help by moving red chairs to this side, not folding them up, and the brown chairs to that side, not folding them up, that would be a big help.
So I suggest that if you have questions, raise your hand, and I'm going to pass the mic back and forth. Does that sound like a good idea? Okay. I think it's on.
Jack, thanks for coming. I guess the question I had, I'm a member here at St. Paul's, is what's the best way that we, as a people gathered here at St. Paul's, can help to bring this matter of utmost importance? How can we best provide a way to share that with the folks here in our time and place in 2019 in Syracuse, New York?
Well, you know, the reason I began with the sermon today with your mission statement was it was so good. I mean, if you're doing that, if that's true, if what you're saying in that mission statement is true, you've got a running start on it. But are you asking how you get it beyond your community into the wider Syracuse community?
Yes.
That's your problem. I'm going home after this. See, I'm an academic. I'm never sure how to answer these questions. People always say, this sounds good in theory, how do you do it in practice? I always like to say, well, what you're doing is good in practice, how does it work in theory? I think you have a sense here that the mission statement doesn't say anything as far as I could find from the Nicene Creed. Did you notice that? There's nothing from is there? I don't think so. It talks about doubters and searchers and nothing from the Nicene Creed. But what you're doing, it seems to me, is converting it into what you call not theology, but theopraxis, the doing of God rather than the logos about God. And I would say, do what you're doing and keep doing it and do more. One thing I noticed, and I always notice this, is the preponderance of older people in the congregation. The gray hairs dominate. It's like the Catholic priests. There's a sea of gray hair. And there are a few young people. And that's because religion has made itself unbelievable to young people. My kids have no understanding. They just find it incomprehensible that I entered the religious life and was a member of a religious order for 4 years. Boy, I think it. That's a bad answer, but it's...
Okay, but was thinking about somewhat the same question, but what do you see the role of relationships playing in this? And with that, I mean relationship with these historical figures, with a Jesus Christ, with other historic figures, and then our relationships today in the world.
Yeah, What I was not suggesting was in any way was that you could somehow or another drop the history, drop the tradition, drop the ancient stories, drop the history of how those stories have been unfolded over the centuries. Because what's come down to us now has come down to us through that tradition. So one thing you notice about the history of the church is that the way, not the continuity, but the way it changes. It keeps reconfiguring. It keeps, it takes the scriptures to be posing a question to which we are supposed to be the answer. And that's always going to be a different question. It's a different question today than it was 50 years ago. And in another 50 years, it's going to be mind-bogglingly different because I think because of the advent of artificial intelligence and what this word postmodern is already spent. You know, its day is over. It peaked in the last quarter of the 20th century. The word that's more fashionable now is post-human. So what's ahead are mind-boggling transformations of the technology and therefore of the self-understanding of human beings, which will transform us profoundly. But that's what this stuff means to us now. We have to think for ourselves now what these stories are telling us, but we can never separate it from the history that gave it to us. Without that history, we wouldn't have remembered the name of Jesus. And each one of those ages over the course of its history was a way, a new age reinterpreted the thing. And it kept changing, it kept getting reconfigured. And if it doesn't, it'll be like a frozen waterfall. It'll just, like, you know, the question, what is the essence of Christianity? My answer is, I don't know, it's not over yet. It's a history. It doesn't have an essence, it has a history. And it's got a future that we can't see coming, and it comes from a past that we have to treasure. We won't understand it if we don't see how it's been reconfiguring all along. But it doesn't stay fixed. The notion of an essence of Christianity, or the notion of a natural law that is somehow or another seen, it's just belied by the facts. So you want study groups who study. Look at what happened. Look at what happened to it with Constantine. Look at the difference between the early church and the church from Constantine on, and see how that's. I remember one time telling my mother, I was a graduate student, and I don't know how it came up. I remember telling my mother, Rosary was a devotion that was created in the Middle Ages, and she was absolutely shocked. It was totally scandalized. You know. She thought the Blessed Virgin made up the Rosary. You know, that's what a Rosary is. Mary made up the Rosary. And I thought, well, I no more of that stuff with Mom. I'm not going to no more theology with her. But you understand the historical contingency. It didn't have to be this way. We didn't have to go through the world that we went through, but we did. We have the history that we did, and that's how this story has been telling itself. And we need to understand that, and to understand that it's not a fixed essence. It's not a frozen waterfall. It's a falling.
You talked toward the beginning about evangelicals and how they fear change. And I see the link between that and what you see as the coming new interpretation. So how do you deal with this fear where we, perhaps in our generation, have an understanding of religion and it cannot be the same because change is coming, and it's a kind of underlying fear of change?
Doesn't anybody have an easy question? I mean, well, that's why I said at the beginning, I don't think it's ultimately a theological question. I think it's a sociological, even in the literal sense, pathological question, having to do with our pathos, our feelings, our affectivity. So dealing with what's happening to Christianity and rural Christianity right now is a matter of a change in the economic system, which will restore public education and restore job training for people they're desperate people. I mean, if your whole family, for as long as you can remember, has been a coal miner, and you know that coal mining is gone, it's not coming back, no matter what people tell you, what do? Then you need to find, the church's role in that community is to be a force for job training and they're rightly afraid. They're not afraid for no reason. They're rightly afraid of what's ahead because it's going to leave them behind. How do you deal with fear? You be there for someone when they're afraid, and you listen to them, and you try to address what's honestly wrong with them, and or what's honestly oppressing them. And we ourselves, I mean, when we talk like this, we like to sort of think, well, we're okay. It's these other people that we have to work on. But our own, I myself am profoundly anxious about what lies ahead in the way of this transhuman transformation that's about to take place. So you fear the future, and then that one of the defining features of this notion of deep faith is a kind of affirmation of the future, which means the affirmation of the coming of what you can't see coming. I'm saying it's like someone knocking on your door unexpectedly at night. The future's like that. Did you answer it? Or should you call 911? Is it somebody who desperately needs help? Or is it somebody meant out there to do you harm? I guess if they're out to do you harm, they would knock on the door. But it's like that. It's opening yourself to what you can't see coming. And affirming the possibilities. The future is a promised threat. And so it is in part fearful. Next question has to be one I can answer.
I will. First of all, Sue.
Ask me something about Heidegger.
I want to ask you something about Girard, but I want to ask.
Girard.
Yeah, but I want to ask Sue first if this is going to, if your congregation is familiar with it, because this may be a better question for me to talk about after this is over. I don't want to, because what I want to ask you is your thoughts about Girard and Memetic Theory within a Christian context, and how you see that as, how you would rank that as a leading edge for communicating to the world the gospel in a way that can get people excited and be serious and give content, you know, that people will relate to, that can actually perhaps make changes in the world. You know, because it's where the rubber meets the road, anthropologically speaking, in terms of human violence, and it puts the religion into that context. So if this is going to be something that people don't even know who Girard is or so on, then maybe I could talk about it afterwards. But I'll let Sue say it.
I think there's a few people who have familiarity with Girard, but I would say in general it's not part of our ongoing conversation here. So I think Jack can say whatever he wants, but I would suggest that you have a larger conversation.
Let me just say this much, because I think Girard was one of the things is Girard's one of the figures who is part of a complete reassessment of what the atonement means, and it's a salutary one. For the first 11 centuries of the church, the notion that Jesus died to pay off our infinite debt to God was unheard of. Nobody in the New Testament ever heard that, and nobody in the history of the church in general. I mean, there were things a little bit like that when he said Jesus died for our sins. It didn't mean what it came to mean in the 11th century when a man named Anselm came up with what's called the satisfaction theory of the crucifixion, in which he said, he wrote a book called Why the God Man, and he said, he had read the New Testament, and he said, the New Testament is myth, it's all these stories, it's crazy, and he was a theologian, and he wanted it to make sense. So he said, look, it makes perfect sense. The crucifixion makes perfect sense. We offended God. God's an infinite being. That's an infinite offense. And therefore, it can only be paid back by a being who is capable of, who has an infinite check account, who has an infinite funds in his checking account. But who is not just simply an infinite being, but also a man or a human being, because it's human beings who sinned. And so therefore, what is logically necessary is a human being who is also God, who can pay this debt off. A woman named Elizabeth Johnson calls it the most successful theological theory in the history of the church. It took over. It became Christianity. It was largely unknown before the 11th century. What was known, what the scriptures are about is Jesus comes into the world announcing the coming of God's rule. The time is coming when the Romans are going to get their comeuppance, and the powers and the principalities, the demons, are going to meet with the forces of God, and God will dispel them. And he sends Jesus as his advance man. And Satan, not knowing who he is, falls upon him. And God raises him from the dead. Satan's power is confounded. The kingdom is at hand. It's called the Christus Victor story. It's a mythical battle between the powers of Satan and the powers of God. And God ultimately wins through raising up his Messiah. That's the story. That's what's in the scriptures. Girard is one of these people who comes along and says, look, God is not a child abuser. God did not sacrifice one of his children for his other children. God didn't kill Jesus. The Romans killed Jesus. And Jesus is being scapegoated. Jesus gets treated as a scapegoat in the history of Christianity. So he says, what the meaning of the crucifixion is God's solidarity with the victim, God's solidarity with the crucified. And the scriptures are exposing the demonic power which killed Jesus. They're exposing the evil of injustice and oppression and tyrannical rule and coercive force and violence, the sacredness of violence. And the dominant interpretation of the atonement nowadays in people like Girard and in people like the liberation theologians is the crucifixion is a symbol of the solidarity of God with the oppressed. Has nothing to do with paying off an infinite debt. Has nothing to do with Jesus taking a hit for the rest of us. It's not in the scriptures. It was not a dominant theology in the first 11 centuries of the church. It is Anselm. Luther saw through it, but because he was reading the scriptures carefully, but what Luther said got picked up into and made worse in Protestant and post-Lutheran Christianity because it was called penal atonement theory, penal satisfaction theory. It became even more severe, more violent. So I would say that Girard and the liberation theologians are vanguards of a totally different way to understand the crucifixion. And a way that makes sense. It makes sense. The notion of paying off an infinite debt to an angry deity is who do they expect to believe that? expect to believe it. The notion that Jesus spoke truth to power, and they took him out. Pilate probably never knew he was even in the crowd. I mean, if we know, what we know about Jesus' death is that he died. He was crucified. That's it. That's the end of the historical evidence. The Passion narratives are constructed from Isaiah and from the Old Testament, and they're not in the most ancient text. They're not in the earliest records we have. But they're not a story about a payoff. Not a story about paying off the debt. They're a story about the victims of injustice. Jesus was making trouble in a crowded city in the high holy days, and the soldiers had standing orders to take out anybody who started trouble. No trial. Pontius Pilate was a cruel, bloodthirsty procurator who had no compunction about taking out a Jew who was causing trouble. The notion that he washed his hands and said he's a good man, and the Jews are doing this, not me, complete fiction. It's a narrative. It's a narrative. What we know about the crucifixion is the crucifixion. He got crucified. That's all we know. And the thing is to understand it, to interpret it, to have a hermeneutic of it. Girard is onto the right hermeneutic. The liberation theologians are onto the right hermeneutic. There's a new understanding of the atonement now that you won't find, except in very conservative seminaries, you won't find classical atonement theory around anymore. The only people who teach it now are the people who are going to get fired if they don't. Somewhat cynical way to put it. I'm sure they believe it, but I do think that that's true. We got till 20 out.
Yeah, I think if a question has a simple answer, we can have one more question.
Okay, we need a 3-minute question.
I might have more than a 3-minute question, but I'll put it out anyways. In your sermon, you point a lot to language, and like you say, hospitality comes from this word, and therefore so on and so forth. And you use that to build a foundation for explaining. But as we know, language is defined by its use, and language is unbecoming of the ineffable. So, what do you think the role language has in keeping people attached to their paradigms?
What do I think the what language?
What do you think the role language has?
The role of language.
Yeah.
Well, it's valuable. Yeah. I mean, ancient meanings resonate in these words, and I happen to like to pay attention to etymologies because they have historical resonance, and they're picking up things that were part of the history of its use. So I don't think words have a fixed meaning or an essence. I think they have a history of use. And the etymologies reveal the use. So I will often use etymologies. So it's not unusual for philosophers or for academics to do that. What are you getting at? I got a feeling I'm not getting at something that you want.
I want to reframe that really quick because you were saying something specific, and I want to reintroduce that very quickly. I'm sorry to interject so quickly. The ineffable, the apophatic. Is there room in, for example, your understanding of your philosophy? Language is important, but is there still apophatic or ineffable experience ground, something that would have been once called transcendental?
Thank you. I missed that. I mean, I knew I was missing something.
Does that sound good?
Yeah. My whole presupposition is what I was saying about the unconditional, is that what we're dealing with is, we're lighting matches in a vast dark universe, and we're talking about. Karl Rahner uses, the Catholic theology uses this expression, the mystery we call God, and maybe we're going to call it something else someday, but the mystery will be with us, and the more we get to understand, the deeper and darker the mystery. So, yeah, my presupposition is, my presupposition is something that a German philosopher named Schelling called das Unvordenkliche, literally that which we cannot, the unprethinkable, that which is the givenness of being, which is there. As soon as we open our eyes, the world is already up and running. The being is given. It's the prios. It's the first thing. It's the prior. And what thought is trying to do is make dents in it, scratch its surface, to get at it, to sort of become commensurate with it, which it can never do. And right now, and this is why I was talking about transhumanism. Right now, what I actually think is that an older theory that was prevalent back in the middle of the 20th century is starting to make a comeback, a theory called panentheism. The notion that God's not identical with the world, but God is sort of the deep ground of the world. And all things come from God and return to God. And what that's beginning more and more to sound like to me is the universe itself, the mystery of the universe itself, which is, the more we get to understand about it, the more incomprehensible it becomes. The possibility of infinite universes, that this universe is just one universe, and like that. And yeah, so my idea is, presupposes the ultimate incomprehensibility. It doesn't mean unintelligibility. Incomprehensibility. Comprehend means get your arms around it, get your head around it, and grasp it. The ultimate ungraspability of being, where thought is a kind of, begins by acknowledging that. So not just pure reason, but what this fellow Schelling calls ecstatic reason. A reason has confessed its exposure to something that it has by which thought has been overtaken.
That's good.
Thank you, Jack, for a wonderful sermon and also a very fascinating conversation here today. Thank you. Let's all